Hi class, in this video we are starting chapter 6, which is the learning chapter. This tends to be, just a heads up, one of the more difficult chapters for students because of all of the components of classical conditioning, because of all the different types of operant conditioning. It can be just very confusing. So make sure you take good notes. Make sure you practice examples. You can do this. Before we get into the specific types, just some general definitions connected to learning. First, what is learning not? Learning is not reflexes. Learning is not instincts. A reflex is a motor or neural reaction to a specific stimulus in the environment. They are simpler than instincts, which we'll talk about next. And it's just an activity of a specific part of the body or a specific system. It usually involves more primitive parts of the central nervous system, just your spinal cord or just the brain stem. There's not a lot of conscious thought that goes into this. For example, when you go to the doctor and they hit your knee and it pops up, that's a reflex. You don't have to think about it. Even if you are brain dead, clinically brain dead, you would still have that reflex. So those are reflexes. We will talk a little bit about reflexes when we do a type of learning because they can be used to initiate learning, become a part of learning, but in and of themselves, you don't learn reflexes. They are natural, as are instincts. Instincts are innate behaviors that are triggered by a broader range of events, things like aging or a change in the seasons. For example, salmon that swim upstream to spawn, geese that fly south for the winter, in Mexico, in Baja, there are whales that migrate down just for the winter and then they go back up. We have monarch butterflies that come down for winter and then go back north for the summer. You don't have to teach them this. They're born and they just automatically do this. So they're more complex, like swimming upstream to spawn is more complex than your knee shooting up when it gets hit. But they are unlearned. They also tend to involve higher brain centers. This is not just brainstem activity. If you are clinically brain dead, you are not going to migrate south for the winter. So again, you are born with both these instincts and reflexes. They don't have to be learned. Learning is different because it involves change, it involves experience. The official definition for learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that results from experience. And this whole chapter, we are talking about different types of learning. The first type of learning that we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about it with a few different types of learning, is associative learning. And associative learning is when an organism makes connections between stimuli or events that occur together in the environment. So you think this thing goes with that thing, you learn that, and so your behavior changes based on that assumption. If this happens, then that's about to happen. And so the two main types of associative learning we're going to talk about are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And first, we're going to talk about classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, the definition for that is a process by which we learn to associate stimuli and consequently to anticipate events. Classical conditioning was created by Ivan Pavlov. It was unintentional. He was studying dogs and he was studying their salivary response. And so what he did was he would put them in this contraption and he had attached test tubes to their salivary glands. So he'd cut open their cheeks and attach test tubes. That's why he had to strap him into this contraption, because if they've got test tubes on their cheeks, they couldn't be running around. And then he would put meat powder in front of them. And if you put meat powder in front of a dog, that dog is going to salivate. This is unlearned. This is a reflex. You don't have to teach a dog to salivate to meat powder. Every dog on earth is going to do it. But as he was doing this, he realized that the dogs started to salivate before the meat powder was put in front of them. They started to salivate when they heard the footsteps of the research assistant coming down the hall with the meat powder. The sound of those footsteps would get the dogs salivating. And so Pavlov realized that they were salivating because they knew what was coming. When they heard those footsteps, they knew they were about to get meat powder, and so they just started to salivate. This is classical conditioning. And so there are several steps to this, several definitions that you need to know: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, neutral stimulus, conditioned response. And we'll go through these using Pavlov as an example. So after he realized that these research assistants, their footsteps were making the dog salivate, then he started to play with it. He started to do experiments and discovered classical conditioning. So for example, he would, the first thing he did was he used a metronome, and he'd play a metronome before he gave the dogs the meat powder. And then, so when they heard the metronome, they would salivate. That's a long word. I don't want to have to write that a bunch. So we'll say bell. That was another thing he did. He'd ring a bell, and eventually the dog started salivating when they heard the bell. He flipped on a light switch. He did lots of different stuff. But we're going to use bell because it's easy. So what he did was, and we'll go through these definitions. Let me define these definitions, and then I'm going to write the classical conditioning equation for you so that you can see how this works. So first, unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus that elicits a reflexive response in the organism. The unconditioned response is a natural, unlearned reaction to a given stimulus, to the unconditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus is a stimulus that does not naturally elicit a response. The conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a response after repeatedly being paired with an unconditioned stimulus. And then the conditioned response is the behavior caused by the conditioned stimulus. So let's go through the classical conditioning equation so you can figure this out. So here's the equation, and we'll go through this for the different parts. The very first stage, unconditioned stimulus leads to unconditioned response. At this point, this is not learning. What this is, for classical conditioning, something to make sure you have in your notes. Classical conditioning is with involuntary behaviors, like reflexes. You are not consciously learning classical conditioning. This is just going to happen. So for example, in Pavlov's experiment, at this stage, the unconditioned stimulus is the meat powder, and the conditioned stimulus is salivation. So again, you don't have to teach this to a dog. This is not learning, this is just life. What happens in the next stage is that you add in a neutral stimulus before you present the unconditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus is something that doesn't have a natural response. Like, for example, for dogs, if you ring a bell, there is no natural response that every dog on earth is going to have. It's just a random thing. So a neutral stimulus is added. And then what happens is that you present that neutral stimulus enough times right before you give the unconditioned stimulus that the animal makes that link in its mind, or that humans can do classical conditioning too. So that link is made in your mind That if I hear the bell, that means the meat powder is about to come. And so your body will respond involuntarily to that bell the same way that it responded to the meat powder. And when that happens, then that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. So the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same thing. What determines when you call it a neutral stimulus versus when you call it a conditioned stimulus is whether it elicits a response. The first time you salivate just to the sound of the bell, or the dog salivates, then it is called a conditioned stimulus. At the same time, when that happens, now the salivation is called a conditioned response. So the unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same thing. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are always the same thing. What determines when you call it unconditioned stimulus or unconditioned response or conditioned response or neutral stimulus or conditioned stimulus is when that bell caused the salivation. So that is classical conditioning. And by the way, when you make that link in your mind, when you say, okay, I hear the bell, I know I'm about to get the meat, I'm going to salivate, that is acquisition. So acquisition is when you make that link in your mind, that initial period of learning when you learn to connect the neutral stimulus with that unconditioned stimulus. So that is the equation for classical conditioning I would definitely have in your notes. And let's get into some other fancy definitions here. One is higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is when you pair a new neutral stimulus with a conditioned stimulus. And so for this, for example, it will look like this. What you do is you present a new neutral stimulus before the conditioned stimulus. It doesn't come right before the unconditioned stimulus. For example, turn on a light switch, ring a bell, present the meat powder. You do this enough times, the dog is going to salivate to the light switch. Not because the light switch was paired with the meat, but because the light switch was paired with the bell, and the bell is paired with the meat. So that's higher order conditioning. Another definition to note, taste aversion. In taste aversion, this is when you develop classical conditioning to a taste. So this is like if you, for example, if you go through chemo, nausea is a common side effect of chemo. They tell you to not eat your favorite food when you have a chemo treatment. Because if you get nauseated after the treatment, your brain will connect that with that food and you will stop liking that food. When you look at that food, it will make you nauseated. That's classical conditioning. Taste aversion is one of the fastest ways to go through classical conditioning, and it's one of the longest lasting. It takes just one occurrence and you can develop it. It's evolutionary. It helps with survival. If you ate berries back in the day and they made you violently ill, and so every time you see that berry in the future, you don't touch it, you're more likely to survive. The person that's like, let me just try these again, is gonna die. So we have evolved to have a fast classical conditioning response to foods that make us ill, and it sticks around. For example, oh gosh, it's been over 25 years ago, I got very sick after eating Taco Bell. Threw up all night long. I have not had Taco Bell since. I smell Taco Bell because it doesn't smell like normal tacos. It's got its own scent. it makes me nauseated. I cannot stand the smell of Taco Bell. That is taste aversion, and I never need to eat Taco Bell again. Okay, so for the next thing, extinction and spontaneous recovery. What happens is that for extinction, the definition for extinction is a decrease in the conditioned response when the unconditioned response is no longer presented with the conditioned response. Or let me say that again. It's a decrease in the conditioned response when the unconditioned stimulus is no longer presented with the conditioned stimulus. What happens is that you break the connection. You no longer give meat powder after you ring the bell. If Pavlov stopped doing that long enough, those dogs are going to stop salivating when they hear the bell. Why? Because it doesn't mean anything anymore. It doesn't mean they're about to get meat powder. Why would you salivate? So if you break that connection, eventually that conditioned stimulus will go back to just being a neutral stimulus. You'll break that acquisition. That's extinction. The weird thing about this, though, is that you can have spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery is when you have a return of a previously extinguished conditioned response following a rest period. So it just pops back up real fast when you aren't expecting it. For example, when I teach this in person, and it's not COVID, I do an experiment. I classically condition the class where everyone gets a little powder, a little cup of lemonade powder, which is very tart. It makes you salivate when this gets put on your tongue because it's so sour. That is a reflex. You put something really sour on your tongue, it's going to make you salivate. You don't have to be taught this. You do this to a baby, bam, salivation. So that's a reflex. But I say Pavlov, and then everyone has to dip their finger in and put a little bit on their tongue, and they salivate. And we do this 10, 20 times until I say the word Pavlov, and everyone just salivates. They don't have to put the lemonade powder on their tongue anymore. Classical conditioning. And then extinction occurs because we only do that one day in class. It's not like for the rest of your life, every time you hear the word Pavlov, if that happens, you're going to salivate. Because it's no longer followed by lemonade powder after you're done with that one class. So extinction occurs. The weird thing is, every once in a while, even now, because it's been, COVID's been going on for a while now. It has been a couple of years since I have done this experiment in a class. Still, every once in a while, I say Pavlov and I salivate. That's spontaneous recovery. Even though I've gone through extinction, every once in a while it pops up again. It'll come back. Three more definitions on this page. Stimulus discrimination and stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is when you learn to respond differently to various stimuli that are similar. Basically, if you have a neutral stimulus that is similar but not identical to the conditioned stimulus, you will not respond to the neutral stimulus with the conditioned response because it's not the same thing. You have learned to discriminate between the two. For example, I live in Mexico. I eat a whole lot of tacos because they're amazing here. But tacos in Mexico are not Taco Bell tacos. They're not even what most tacos are in the US at all. When I make tacos at home that are like ground beef and lettuce on top, we call them tacos gringos because they don't exist in Mexico. You don't get those tacos in Mexico, at least not in Mexico City. They don't exist. I love tacos. I can eat all the types of tacos here, even though I won't touch Taco Bell. Technically, they're similar, there's a tortilla, there is meat inside, there is salsa. But my brain distinguishes between real tacos that aren't going to make me violently ill and Taco Bell tacos. So I don't get nauseated at every single taco on earth, just the Taco Bell tacos. That's stimulus discrimination. It might be similar, a taco's a taco, but it's different enough that my brain knows not to respond with that conditioned response, not to respond with nausea. Stimulus generalization is the opposite. Stimulus generalization is when you show the conditioned response to stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. For example, this is, oh gosh, when I was in Rwanda one time, I was there, this was, oh heavens, like 8 years after the genocide. Or no, yeah, about 8 years after. And it was going to be the first time, I was going to be there, I'm trying to think what time of year it was. For some reason, they were going to put off fireworks. They were going to have lots of fireworks in the Capitol. And this was going to be the first time since the genocide that there were going to be fireworks in the Capitol. And there was this enormous campaign to let people know there were going to be these fireworks so that people didn't freak out when they heard them. So that they would know the loud bangs you hear for these fireworks are not the same thing as the bombs you heard in the genocide and the gunfire you heard in the genocide. You don't need to have that reflex of fear, that fear response to these fireworks. We want you to have stimulus generalization. Realize fireworks are different than bombs. You don't need to respond with that fear. Or another example of stimulus generalization, if a dog bit you when you were 5 and now you are afraid of, you see a dog, any dog, and you get afraid. That's stimulus generalization. Even though it's only that one specific dog that has hurt you, you just generalize it to any dog that is similar, you're going to be afraid. That's stimulus generalization. And the final, sorry, I'm going to sneeze. The final definition for this page is habituation. Habituation is when you learn not to respond to a stimulus that is presented repeatedly without change. For example, if you, oh gosh, here's an example. Several years ago, I taught at a community college in North Carolina that was right next to a Marine base, a really large Marine base, Camp Lejeune. And so a lot of my students were Marines. I even taught a class on the base. So lots of Marines in my class. And this was during, I started teaching there in 2010. So this was when the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War were still going on. So I had a lot of combat vets in my class. They had just come back from war. They were in my class. And at that time, the experiment I did in class for classical conditioning was I would have classmates pair up and you would say a random word like candy and then clap in your classmate's face. And that would, when you clap in someone's face, that should cause, my dog's barking, that should cause a startle response. You should blink. It's natural, you don't have to teach it. Clap in a baby's face, they're gonna blink and then cry, but they'll blink. And so you'd say the word, clap, they'd blink, until eventually you say the word and the person would blink. I had to stop using that example and switch to the lemonade powder because I had so many combat vets in my class who had trained themselves out of not responding to loud sounds or movements with the startle response. Because they'd had that so much in the war, they didn't respond anymore to it. It didn't work for them. That's habituation. Another example of habituation that has happened to y'all, since I'm assuming none of y'all are combat vets. If you're sitting in the classroom and the AC shuts off or the heat shuts off, and that's when you realized it was on. There had been that noise going on, but your brain had tuned it out. That's habituation. Instead of responding to it and noticing it, because it's this unchanging sound, your brain starts to ignore it. It starts to say, who cares? I don't need to respond to the sound because it's unchanging. And so you don't even realize it's there anymore until it shuts off. And that's when you realize it had been going on. So that is habituation. What we're going to do now is the final thing for this. Well, actually, before this, we're going to do 2 more things. I'm going to tell you about little Albert, and then I'm going to show you 2 examples of classical conditioning, and you have to go through what the parts are. But briefly, little Albert, and then 2 examples, and that'll be it for this video. I'm only talking about classical conditioning in this video. We'll start with operant conditioning in the next one. The little Albert experiment was done by John Watson and Rosalie Rayner. And what they did was they found a very chill baby. I think he was like 13 months old. They paid the mom $1 for the child to be able to participate. And they set it up so it was classical conditioning. They put the kid down on the ground. They put a little white rat in front of him. And there's no natural response when a kid sees a rat. Like, he was like, oh, cute. He just sort of sat there very chill. Didn't do anything. And then what they would do was they'd bang a loud pipe right behind the kid's head. Now, there is a natural response to that. You bang a loud pipe behind any kid's head, they are going to cry. It's just natural. It happens. And so when they did that enough times, here's the rat bang, that when little Albert saw that wet rat, he would start to cry. And so this is classical conditioning with emotions. That is a conditioned emotional response. A conditioned emotional response is when you have classical conditioning with emotions. And so if you're going to think about it, in terms of our equation, the banging pipe makes the kid afraid. You give the white rat before you bang the pipe, so eventually the kid cries at the sight of the white rat. Now, a couple of questions for you. One question, after the kid was all freaked out, after little Albert was crying just at the sight of the white rat, they showed him a white rabbit, and he cried at the sight of the white rabbit too. What is that? And then next question, final question for this, they set it up so that, the experiment was over, they moved on with life, and they eventually, little Albert was not crying when he saw a white rat. After the experiment was done, a year later, he no longer cried at the sight of a white rat. What is that? Okay, so actually I'm just going to show you, one example, of classical conditioning with lupus. So they classically condition someone with lupus. For this, what you need to know, what you have to be able to label, is what is the unconditioned stimulus, what is the unconditioned response, what's the neutral stimulus, conditioned response. Just a heads up, when they talk about a strong smell, that was rose perfume that they used. And when they talk about a strong taste, it was fish oil. So fish oil and rose perfume. So watch that video now.
Merritt had lupus, a disease in which the immune system is overactive. Her antibodies turned against her, attacking her own tissues and organs. When it first struck, Merritt was 11 years old. Doctors prescribed powerful drugs to curb the self-destruction. But the drugs had unpleasant side effects.
This picture was when I was in like the 8th grade, I believe. I was on 80 milligrams of steroids a day because they didn't know what to do. So they picked steroids as the route. And steroids not only made my face look like I swallowed a blimp, but it made my hair fall out. So every morning I went to breakfast and my hair would fall in my food, or I'd get up and there was hair all over my pillows like I was 70 or so.
Quite honestly, the effect of the drugs terrified me. I thought it was, again, psychologically damaging as well as physically damaging. And I had doubts about whether her body could recover from such stringent, tough treatment, and what this was doing to her spirit.
Merritt's mother is a clinical psychologist. She knew that Robert Eder had experimented on mice that had lupus. Using Pavlovian conditioning, Eder had taught the lupus mice to suppress their overactive immune systems. The mice were then able to survive longer without the need for drugs.
What I read in the Eder and Cohen paper was that these little mice had been given sugar water and the medication, and that their immune systems had been contained or suppressed or back to a manageable level with the disease. And I thought to myself, now, why couldn't people do this?
As a last-ditch measure, they tried to see if conditioning would work for Merritt. Merritt had to learn to associate a strong taste or smell with the effects of the steroid drug, which could slow down her runaway immune system. The conditioning appeared to work. Soon, just the taste or smell meant she was able to halve her dose of drugs.
The impact of the immune conditioning was that at a very scary, terrifying time when not only Merritt but the whole family felt really powerless, it was something that we participated in which she began to be in charge of her part of the treatment. Merritt died in 1995 on Valentine's Day of a heart attack, and the heart attack was precipitated by, very simply, clogged arteries, which is a side effect of the medication that we started trying to wean her from. I feel, looking back, that it was really a tremendous step in the right direction. I would also say that she would agree that it gave her probably 10 years more life than we expected that she would have.
Okay, so random comment. When they talk about how they halved her dose, they were able to cut her dose of steroids in half. The reason for that, the reason they couldn't just totally stop giving her steroids, is because extinction would have occurred. So what they did was every other time, she still got the medicine so that they could prevent extinction. If they had totally stopped giving her the medicine, her brain would have stopped connecting that fish oil and rose perfume with the medicine. It would have stopped suppressing the immune system. So that's why they could only have her dose, do it every other time, so that extinction didn't happen. And that is it for this video.